On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, Mexico. The left-leaning populist candidate has become the Mexican president-elect. Can he improve thorny relations with the United States?
It's Canadians ourselves.
And Canada is following the EU to go against the U.S. tariffs against its exports. Will these make a difference? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live on CGTN. Today we're going to focus our attention on the history in Mexico. History has been made earlier today in Mexico when the country elected its next president, Lopez Obrador, the leader of the National Regeneration Movement. This election is one of the many firsts, as Obrador secured a landslide victory with the largest ever margin of a presidential race. He will become the first left-wing president in decades, dethroning the dominant party's 70-year rule. But violence marred the elections as over 100 political candidates were murdered since September. Faced with what Obrador described as decadent political regime, Mexico will need to deal with widespread crime and corruption. Let's take a look at this.
Lowering the salaries of the rich and raising those of the poor makes me the populist at the top of the list.
As Mexicans go to the polls on Sunday, the country will reach the end of the bloodiest election process in its entire history. In nearly 300 days of official electioneering, 133 politicians have been murdered, and the authors of a study on the violence say the organised crime groups they were pledging to tackle were most often behind the plots. It has left politicians treading a fine line between appealing to the electorate and appeasing the cartels.
The narco has become a very powerful force in Mexico, and that has partly been because the government has not known how to control them. In becoming powerful, they have imposed themselves upon local leaders, forcing them to ignore their activities for fear of worsening violence.
As Mexico's war on drugs turns inward and criminal organizations turn to activities such as kidnapping and extortion to keep their profits steady, it's perhaps no surprise that lawmakers who promise the public the change they crave become targets.
It will be very difficult to break the current levels of complicity between the authorities and organized crime. It will require a strong government that also has the support of the people. The most important thing will be to pursue the politicians that have allowed this to occur. From that point, things can improve.
As a result of the violence, Mexico's choices Sunday are reduced. 48 of the 133 politicians killed had been running for office, mostly at the local level. Now Mexicans will look to those left, who come out victorious, to be the agents for change.
And now let's turn to our panelists for the latest analysis about the Mexican election. With us in Beijing studio, we have Professor Jiang Shixue, who's a professor with Shanghai University. Welcome, sir. And also one of the seasoned analysts coming from China on Latin American studies. And also joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Manuel Lopez Obrador, who is the economist in residence at the American University and former chief of staff of the governor of the Bank of Mexico. Welcome as well. May I start with you, Mr. Lopez-Obrador? Tell me about this new president-elect. He was campaigning on populist rhetorics, but when he is coming into power, apparently, will he be able to do what he has promised?
Well, we don't know any way to know that. Because what he has promised during the campaign have been all sorts of witticisms and generalities, and if the diagnostics are mistaken as to what are the ills of society, the remedy that he will apply is also mistaken. So I'm not very hopeful that he will be able to fulfill any of the promises that he made during the campaign.
Let's talk about some of these campaigns, Mr. Jiang, here in Beijing. One of it is against corruption. The other is against the crime. Thirdly, of course, is against the drug problems.
Economy also.
The economy also. We're going to leave the economy a little bit later because that's supposed to be one of the most important issues. But what about the corruption, the crimes, the drugs?
Well, these issues are really very important for Mexico and any other countries in the region. So it is right for him to say so. I believe he will do something towards his promise. But, well, he will going to stay in office for only 6 years. 6 years is a too short period of time for him to deal with all these kinds of problems. But hopefully, some of the problems can be reduced so that the people can have a peaceful, harmonious life in Mexico today.
Of course, Mr. Suarez Mir, I mean, the president-elect, he was campaigning against so-called big business interests. He believed there has been interactions, too much of it, between those business communities and the politicians. And he believes that's where the root problems of corruption is in Mexico. The question is, if he wants to develop the economy, he has to work with these people, right?
Yes. Well, let me first address the issue of corruption. Mr. Lopez Obrador is surrounded by some of the most corrupt people in Mexico. During his tenure as mayor of Mexico City, several of his closest aides were caught stealing and receiving bribes. I don't understand why just saying that he's against corruption means anything when he's surrounded by corrupt people. That's one issue. The other is his wrong diagnosis about violence. He contends that violence in Mexico is not the result of a war against drugs, which is completely absurd, but the result of bad distribution of income and poverty, which is complete nonsense. There is an absolute disconnect between that diagnosis and what follows, which is he's going to try to address the violence issue by trying to redress the distribution of income. That has no connection whatsoever to the issue.
Well, Mr. Jiang, of course, there are different debates about exactly what are the root causes of violence going on inside Mexico. But you said earlier, Mr. Jiang, that 6 years is not going to make a difference. So he has the benefits of the doubt in a way, a certain advantage over his counterparts. But the question is, what can he begin with that would at least win him some credibility to push forward the second round of work if he could do it?
I will say that there's one very interesting point here. Lopez Obrador said probably he's going to have a peaceful talk with the drug cartels. Okay, the former president Calderon used the hawkish action, fought against these kind of drug cartels, and now the new president-elect is going to have a peaceful talk with this drug cartel. So probably that will work, but who knows?
Mr. Suarez, Amir, will that work? The so-called softer approach?
That's very naive. The drug cartels are now branched into a multi-faceted business. They're into extortion, into kidnapping, into stealing gasoline, for instance, and other raw materials. So this is a far more complicated issue. It's not just that these guys are selling in the business of transporting and selling drugs into the U.S. market. They have branched into a nefarious multi-tentacle business in crime.
Well, then the question is, why is AMLO become such a popular political candidate that he's now already the president-elect? If we take a look at this, the 64-year-old AMLO was elected with at least 53% of the vote, more than his rivals combined, according to a quick account by Mexico's Electoral Commission. A distant second is Ricardo Anaya from the National Action Party, who got 22%. Jose Antonio Miade, a career civil servant, came in third with around 16%. So you see there's a huge difference over there. Of course, the current president-elect, already in his 60s, he was campaigning very similarly to what you have witnessed over the past 10 years, now including in America, on populist rhetorics. You could see President Trump was elected into the office as a result of that too. So what exactly is going on in Latin America, North America, and probably also in European countries? And is he part of that wave now of politicians coming into the office? Let's have Mr. Suarez-Mier for your analysis first.
Well, there are several factors operating here. First, the demagoguery and the promises. You know, this has been a very strong medicine, the populist message, as we have seen over and over in different countries. The other issue is that this was a three-way race. And so the other two candidates divided the anti-Lopez vote, and they were not very attractive candidates. In the case of Mr. Anaya, he originally was from the center-right PAN, and they made a coalition with the center-left PRD, which doesn't make any sense in historical terms. So he destroyed his party. He lost a lot of support that otherwise the PAN candidate would have had. In the case of my friend and former student, Jose Antonio Meade, he's an excellent economist and top-notch public official, but he was not a good candidate. And he was sponsored by a brand which is highly damaged, which is the PRI, the PRI. So between those two elements, the election was clearly AMLO's to win, and he moderated his speech. I don't think he has moderated in any other way, and he is going to pursue very radical policies. But he moderated his speech, and he appeared to be less dangerous. So he attracted lots of undecided votes.
I see. Well, each, or shall I say every one of the three, have their own backgrounds and their own approach. But the question is, Professor Jiang, even though he came with populist rhetorics, here is the moment that he's in the office. Will he become pragmatic? That is the issue. And what does that mean, to be pragmatic the Mexican way, Professor?
Well, yes, nowadays, you know, in the perspective of political sciences, it's really hard for you to say what is right and what is left. Okay, there's no difference at all on some issues. Now, let's take a look at the former president of Brazil, Mr. Lula. Well, before he came to power, many people, particularly these investors, were very concerned about his so-called populist policies. I know that Tian Wei likes to use this word populism. But after Lula came to power, we could see that there was some kind of difference. So President Lula was very pragmatic. Actually, he carried out some kind of policies which can be considered as very market-friendly. So nowadays, well, you can say Mr. Lopez Obrador is a populist. Well, who knows? Maybe after he comes to power, he might become pragmatic. So I would suggest that he might be the Mexican Lula.
Oh, really? Well, we have Mr. Suarez-Mir, who certainly was supporting his opponent, now waving his head while you were talking about that, Professor Jiang. So, Mr. Suarez-Mir, what do you think? Will he become pragmatic? Will he lead the country to go against the poverty as he has promised once again to the poor people of Mexico?
I have very serious doubts about that. Lopez is no Lula. Look at
why?
the composition of the team that Mr. Lula da Silva put together. And he got the best of the best in terms of finance minister, central bank governor, etc. Look at the team that Mr. Lopez Obrador has already announced. It's a team of mediocrities. The guy who is going to be the Secretary of the Treasury is a doctor in mathematics who has no international financial experience whatsoever.
Wow.
Unlike what Lula did in Brazil, he brought the best people to manage the finances of his country. So I think the difference is radical, and Lopez Obrador is thinking in cartoonish terms. He will change history along with his heroes in the historical, his version of Mexico's history.
Well,
so I think it's going to be
Mr. Suarez,
pure demagoguery.
If you think about some of those politicians who did not have political experience and yet came into power now in European countries, in the United States, and probably, as you said, in Mexico, even though the current president-elect was actually the mayor of the Mexico City, as you have indicated earlier. Actually, he had some political experience. So you never know whether one will, when they empower, and whether the team that he has assembled will be able to do their job. Let me ask you about this. How important it is, Mr. Suarez-Mir, that Mexico's relations with the United States will eventually have an impact on its overall economic policy and economic realities?
Well, it happens to occur in the worst possible moment. As a matter of fact, I believe that one of the reasons why Lopez Obrador got elected was precisely Trump and Trump's relentless attacks and insults on Mexico and the Mexicans. The relationship is very fragile. Mr. Trump has already said that he doesn't want to sign any extension or revision of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, until after the midterm elections in November. So that leaves the whole issue up in the air while he continues to pursue his policy of applying tariffs. And Mexico, as well as other countries, have reciprocated adopting our own tariffs vis-a-vis US products. So this is we're in the middle of a trade war.
We
Now,
are in the middle of
how is that?
Go ahead.
How is the new government going to deal with that? And bear in mind that the new government will take over power until December 1st. So we have a long transition period of 5 months.
December 1st, maybe that's a good occasion, some would say, because it's already after the U.S. midterm election. Things could maybe go into different directions, some suspect. Let's have Mr. Richard Miles, who is the Director of U.S.-Mexico Futures Initiative and Deputy Director of the Americas Program at CSIS. Sir, finally, it's great to be connected to you. I want to have your very quick analysis about what would that be, the impact of a very new name in the office of the Mexican president and in its relations with the United States, given that NAFTA, given that the wall, the border wall between the United States and Mexico is still in the minds of President Trump.
Right. Well, an awful lot depends on the reaction or the relationship between Lopez Obrador and Donald Trump. As we've seen, Donald Trump puts an awful lot of emphasis on personal relationships and personal statements. So we'll see how that develops. I would say that it was very interesting listening to Lopez Obrador's speech last night that he gave in the Zocalo. There are some things he didn't say, and it was very striking. He didn't say Donald Trump once. He didn't say NAFTA, and he didn't say the United States. So I think there is, there may be some room there for a relationship to build.
Some room there, but that could be very tricky, as you may know, sir. For example, the three things that we have just mentioned, NAFTA, the border wall, and also the immigration problems. These are all boiling inside the U.S., as you may know very well. So if there are any advice coming from your side for the new Mexican president for his best national interest, what would you say?
Well, I think he needs to do what the previous Mexican government did, and that is develop very strong personal relationships at sort of the second and third tier in the American government. What I mean by that is the previous government, the foreign minister, Luis Videgaray, had a very close relationship, or does, with the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. I think the new Mexican government needs to develop those personal contacts to senior levels of the White House and the State Department to continue the conversation on all these things, like security cooperation is a huge issue. Obviously, migration and the border issues are very, very sensitive, and of course NAFTA. But NAFTA, as we know, changes from day to day, so that'll be a very difficult policy for the new Mexican government to adjust to.
That is true. It is a very difficult policy for anyone to adjust to, by the way. But
absolutely, yes.
Before we go, let's also have Mr. Jiang here from Beijing. When you are looking at what is going on inside North America, I mean, China now is doing its global outreach to different countries, having different kinds of cooperative projects, and also have different kinds of partnerships. What is China having in mind looking at what is going on now in Mexico?
Well, between China and Mexico, there is a so-called comprehensive strategic partnership. By saying a comprehensive strategic partnership, that means the two countries have very, very good relationship in every aspect, politics, economic, trade, people-to-people exchanges. So I would say that no matter who will govern Mexico, the bilateral relationship between our two sides will continue to move forward. And that's a kind of a relationship based on win-win. And I would say it's also a part of the South-South cooperation.
I hope pragmatism will be in the air when we talk about bilateral relations and multilateral interactions. Thank you so much for now, three gentlemen, for being with us and also providing your insights. Jiang Shixue, Richard Miles, and Manuel Lopez Obrador. Thank you so much. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, on CGTN. Still to come on our program.